into the bank's possession. And we can only get it from the bank, of course, by borrowing. So the principal that we pay out of circulation has to be reborrowed back as new debt, thus equal to the sum of debt it might otherwise resolve, thus making it mathematically impossible to pay down the sum of debt. So long as we have to reborrow principal that we pay out of the circulation as new debt equal to the old debt which otherwise would have been resolved, it's mathematically impossible to maintain a vital circulation and pay down the sum, any prior sum of debt. But what interest we pay out of the circulation and must reborrow back into circulation therefore increases the sum of debt, because paying interest didn't count any at all against the former sum of debt. And so as we reborrow that as new debt above the prior sum of debt, thus the sum of debt increases by so much as periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt. So as the sum of debt increases, then the sum of debt increases at an inherently escalating rate in proportion to a circulation, because we're paying out of circulation periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt. So in fact, the rate of failure escalates itself at an inherently escalating rate until ultimately we suffer a terminal sum of artificial indebtedness to mere publishers of evidence of our promissory obligations, who launder title to all property into their unlawful possession, because they never gave up lawful consideration, and they're not the rightful issuers of our promissory obligations. This is why every central banking system of the world has been imposed upon the subject country without the assent or even the understanding of the people. If its mechanics were revealed to us, we would never agree to this. It's impossible. It's theoretically impossible for an intelligent public to give their assent to a so-called central banking system or banking system based on this obfuscation of the currency. They're not banking systems at all. They are, in fact, modern money changers, and that's all they are.
That's right.
Obfuscation. They're obfuscators of our promissory obligations to each other, to which obligations they are an entirely extrinsic, uninvolved property.
And for those who are listening who are kind of hearing this word obfuscate all the time, obfuscate is just in this situation, it amounts to nothing less than a lie.
Right. And technically, the reason that I use the word obfuscate is like you're a software developer, I'm a software engineer, and obfuscation is a well-known term to software engineers, because obfuscation is used to confuse the end product of source code so that it cannot be easily deciphered what it does or how it accomplishes it. Obfuscate means to confuse in such a manner so that we can't tell exactly what's going on and how whatever is accomplished is accomplished.
That's right, and one of the important themes or principles that any intelligent society needs to understand is that the worst and greatest threat to any society is not necessarily the pure evil. It's not the what you see in the movies. You know, it's not that guy that you immediately know is bad because he's wearing a dark jacket and there's a dark background and there's dark music playing. The worst kind of evil is the kind that shows up in sheep's clothing. Is the kind that is obfuscating things. It's the kind that is a mixture of good and mixture of evil. It's the kind that's the most deceptive because it's the most dangerous, because it's the most difficult to understand.
Yes, and the word evil, as it is used in the scriptures, descends from a Greek word, which means that which is against you. So it's important to understand, in regard to the portrayal of usury as evil in Scripture, that the intended connotation then would be that whatever is against us is what is evil. And of course, this is a conspiracy, a true conspiracy. And people have to understand another thing. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. But the truth of the matter is simply this, that anything and everything done in government is by conspiring. Always. The question is whether or not the conspiracy is for you or against you. And so, in truth, we're conspiring right now. Of course, we're doing so openly and with intended full accountability. Which is a completely different thing than conspiring to impose a central bank, behind closed doors, or the Democrat Party platform being in 1912 to promise not to create a central bank, and then to immediately turn around and use the authors of the Aldrich bill that the Republicans had promised, would solve our problems, and in fact could only cause them, as we've said, by this obfuscation of the currency. And then to turn out a so-called Federal Reserve Act, renaming of the Aldrich bill by a purposely deceptive name. The entire thing is intentionally deceptive. All of the marks about it portray that it is against us, that it was conspired against us. So the difference is to conspire to serve the people, to represent them, and this is one reason which is so important for us to understand these concepts of absolute consensual representation, that any government which would deny its people final affirmation, at least, on any such proposition does not serve its people, is actually disposed to deny them representation. So
and for them to perpetuate the conspiracy, because that's what it is. I mean, as you correctly have said, we're conspiring right now. The difference is we're not doing it in secret. Mm-hmm. So, when you see people doing things in secret, as Kennedy warned us in that famous speech, that good things don't happen in the dark; they happen in the light. Right. And when the lights go out and there's darkness and you're not quite sure what's going on out there, that's because something's going on that they don't want you to know about. And the reason they don't want you to know about it is so that they can get gain. And the kind of gain they're getting is the worst kind of gain, because they're getting it on the backs of good people. They're getting it on the backs of you, yes. the person who's, and me, and the person who's out there working 4 jobs. I remember years ago that President Bush was at a town hall meeting, and a woman stood up and she said, Mr. Bush, I am a single mom and I worked 4 jobs to make ends meet, and I'm still having trouble. And it's so difficult out there. And Bush said, he just got this wry look on his face, and he said to her, well, isn't that uniquely American?
Right.
And I thought to myself, excuse my French, but I thought, you bastard, right. that if I can say that, and I don't normally say things like that, but it's really what I think. That is utterly, that is by definition evil, that which is against you. These men,
absolutely, and people don't understand. I mean, and I don't really, I don't generally draw all this into the discussion, but just. For example, people don't realize, because they're not students of history, that the Bush family has long represented and preserved the banking systems, the central banking systems of the world. In fact, records in our congressional record here, particularly in a speech, I believe it was June 15th, 1932, by Congressman Louis T. McFadden, where he outlines, without even knowing, in 1932, that, 7 years later, World War II is going to erupt. But he outlines, unknowingly at the time, how $60 billion in gold are being removed from the United States Treasury through the Federal Reserve System merely to redeem this paper in gold. You understand our Federal Reserve notes originally stated, we'll pay to the bearer on demand $10. And they said this note is legal tender for all debts public and private, and is redeemable in lawful money, which was so many grains of silver or gold, at the United States Treasury or the Federal Reserve Bank. By issuing them to Germany and redeeming them to Germans in gold, $60 billion of gold were removed annually from the United States Treasury to fund the military preparations of Germany for World War II, and particularly even to pay the debts of the Japanese military preparations to German munition makers. So in 1932, we have in our congressional record a record of this movement of stealing of $60 billion worth of gold annually from the United States Treasury, basically to finance our foes in World War II. And who do we discover when we get to the bottom of this is the person that arranged this, who was the banker of Adolf Hitler, one Prescott Bush, grandfather of the latest President G.W. Bush and father of President G.H.W. Bush.
That's
So,
right.
It's not remarkable that these very otherwise unremarkable men ascended to such power. And what do we see when we examine history is that on both sides of the aisle, all the bets are hedged. The greatest contributors to any candidate who even has a chance at prevailing in election, the greatest contributor is a, quote, financial system, unquote, which is, of course, these modern money changers who have obfuscated the currency by intervening upon our rights to issue promissory obligations free of extrinsic manipulation, adulteration, exploitation. And this is merely what we call, to our own great discredit, what we mistakenly call an economy is instead, as we understand from this obfuscation of the currency, is merely a system of exploitation which accomplishes its purposes by multiplying artificial indebtedness in proportion to a circulation until it dispossesses us of all our production by obligations, periodic obligations, which dedicate so much of the circulation to servicing the artificial sum of debt that we collapse under it, that we cannot afford to sustain the industry, which is compelled to service this sum of artificial, this ever escalating sum of artificial debt, and we fail. And the failure manifests, of course, in the form of the fact that our creditworthiness is nullified to borrow further because we can't even afford to service the eventual terminal sum of debt, which is imposed upon us by this obfuscation.
And
So our
I
inability to pay on any more debt nullifies our creditworthiness to borrow further. So the people then become unable to maintain a vital circulation, and the circulation would immediately deflate in a very dramatic, rapid failure, which explains why all this federal overspending is necessary, because if the government wasn't borrowing at the ever-escalating deficits that they are, which actually exists because the people are unable to pay against anything more. So it is this federal overspending which actually becomes necessary. We become dependent on it merely to maintain a vital circulation. What was
right.
really happening when the Federal Reserve rescued the banking system? They said the federal government was doing it, but the Federal Reserve is doing it merely by issuing so much more paper, obligating us to pay them that much principal and however much interest upon it on into eternity, while our debt is multiplied further. The only thing that's allowing us artificially for the while to sustain the finite lifespans of these systems is the fact that we're not even servicing this debt.
Yeah, and from a Canadian perspective, here's a couple of things for the listeners who are Canadian to understand what to look for in our Canadian economy, the symptoms, so that you can recognize that what we're talking about right now is real. What you need to realize is that the first kinds of communities that will be hit when this starts to happen will be smaller communities. And I spoke to the Liberal candidate up here a little bit about it, about Port Hardy. I was unable to attend that all candidates meeting up there. It's basically a disaster. Port Hardy is a small community on the north of Vancouver Island here. it's a complete economic disaster. Secondly, the thing that we need to understand is that up here in Canada, you guys had your $1 trillion bailout down there in the States. Up here in Canada, you might say, well, I never heard anything about what Canada was doing, but it's a fact that the sitting government, which is the Conservative government, spent $60 billion in bailout, and we didn't do it quite the way you did. What they did is the government simply, as you were just talking about, marched around the country in all the